The courtroom door slammed open, and the tension in the air froze. Every eye in the room turned to the small figure standing in the center of the trial, Emma Carter. Only 16 years old, but her voice rang out with defiance. "You're wrong." The room went completely silent. No one had ever dared to interrupt Judge Richard Donovan, renowned for his harsh sentences and his unwavering authority. But today, a teenage girl had just done the unthinkable. Judge Donovan slammed his gavel down, his cold gaze locking onto Emma. "What did you just say?" His voice was deep, laced with a menacing threat. Emma took a deep breath, her hands clenching tightly to prevent them from trembling. "This man is innocent," she said, each word deliberate, not allowing fear to take over. "The evidence has been tampered with." The courtroom began to murmur, whispers echoing through the seats. Prosecutor Benjamin Hayes narrowed his eyes, a flicker of caution crossing his face. Judge Donovan furrowed his brow. "Are you accusing this justice system?" Emma met his gaze. "I'm accusing someone in this room of deliberately hiding the truth." What could this 16-year-old girl do to turn the tables? Who is the one behind all of this? And more importantly, what is the truth they are trying so desperately to hide? Stay tuned so you don't miss the next shocking moment. Don't forget to subscribe and join us as we uncover the unexpected twists to come. Emma Carter was born and raised in an ordinary neighborhood where small houses stood close together, the old asphalt roads cracked with long fissures, and the sound of car horns echoed every morning. She was a 16-year-old girl with long brown hair always tied up high, deep, sharp eyes that seemed to always be observing, reflecting on everything around her. Though her frame was small, the strength in her gaze and voice left a lasting impression on anyone she met. Emma wasn't the type to be overly social. She had few friends and spent most of her time in the library or sitting alone at the corner cafe, quietly reading books and contemplating the stories of life. She didn't have a perfect childhood. Her parents divorced when she was just 10, leaving a hole in Emma's heart that seemed impossible to fill. Her mother, Sarah Carter, worked as a healthcare worker, often toiling from early morning until late at night to support the two of them. Emma loved her mother, but she also understood that her mother never had enough time to listen to her daughter's thoughts. The late dinners with an empty chair across from her, the quiet nights of studying with the TV blaring from the next room, the restless nights waiting for her mother to return, all these experiences led Emma to form a tough shell around herself. She learned to be independent, facing her problems alone without needing anyone's help. Emma always believed in the truth and justice. As a child, she once witnessed a neighbor being accused of theft simply because he was poor and looked suspicious, even though he had done nothing wrong. At that time, Emma didn't understand why adults were so quick to believe what they wanted to believe instead of searching for the truth. She once asked her mother, "Why doesn't justice come to the innocent on its own?" Her mother sighed, stroked her hair, and said, "Because sometimes justice doesn't come on its own. Someone has to stand up and claim it." Those words haunted Emma for years. From then on, she viewed everything with a different perspective. While her friends talked about romantic movies or fashion, Emma preferred to read news about trials and stories of social injustice. She would often sit for hours in front of the computer, studying famous cases, trying to piece together how the truth could be hidden or distorted. She didn't dream of becoming a lawyer or a judge, but one thing was certain. If injustice happened before her eyes, she wouldn't stay silent. Though she appeared calm on the outside, there was a blazing fire within Emma. She hated lies, couldn't accept injustice, and despised those who used power to oppress the weak. She couldn't just stand by and watch when someone was treated unfairly. But what could a 16-year-old girl do to change a system that had been in place for so long? Would her thirst for justice be strong enough to stand up against forces that even adults feared? This question had followed her for years, and little did she know that in the days ahead, she would find the answer in a way she could never have imagined. The atmosphere in the city grew suffocating as the trial of Daniel Walker entered its most crucial stage. News about the case flooded the newspapers, dividing public opinion. Some believed he was guilty, while others felt something was off. But what made this case even more terrifying was the absence of solid evidence. No fingerprints, no clear witnesses. Yet somehow, Daniel Walker was still charged with murder. Daniel was a middle-aged man with a sharp face and a sorrowful gaze. a single father raising his young daughter alone after his wife passed away from cancer a few years ago. He worked at a small mechanic shop, earning money every day to make ends meet. But just after one fateful night, his life came crashing down. A murder occurred at a deserted parking lot, and simply because Daniel had been in that area that night, the police quickly charged him with murder. Leading the prosecution was Benjamin Hayes, a man with a polished appearance but a reputation for being ruthless and calculating. He didn't care about the truth, he only cared about winning. In the legal world, Hayes was infamous for twisting testimonies, hiding evidence, or pressuring witnesses to achieve his goals. In this case, he crafted a convincing narrative for the jury. Daniel Walker was a desperate man, facing financial difficulties, and had the motive to commit the crime. But what was even more frightening than Prosecutor Hayes was Judge Richard Donovan, the man holding the gavel in this case. Donovan had sat on the bench for over 20 years, and throughout that time, he had never shown mercy to any defendant. To him, the legal system was absolute, regardless of whether the accused was actually guilty. He didn't believe in remorse, nor did he accept weak defenses. When Donovan sat high on his bench, his face was like a cold statue, betraying no emotion. All of these factors turned the trial into an unfair battle. Daniel Walker had only one court-appointed attorney, a person not skilled enough to challenge the aggressive tactics of Prosecutor Hayes. Throughout numerous hearings, the defense's arguments for Daniel were repeatedly rejected, while Hayes's accusations were approved by Judge Donovan without any hesitation. The public couldn't believe the justice system was functioning this way. A man with no clear alibi, but no sign of guilt either, was being slowly pushed into a corner. The day of sentencing was drawing near, and everyone knew that Daniel Walker had no chance of escaping conviction. Daniel Walker was not a murderer. He was a single father, a man who quietly worked every day to provide for his own daughter, Lillian Walker, a 10-year-old girl with big round eyes but plagued by a terminal illness. Since his wife's passing, the lives of the two of them had become more difficult than ever. Mounting medical bills, constant hospitalizations as Lillian's health deteriorated. It felt like an unending spiral, pushing Daniel to the brink of despair. Yet no matter what, he had never considered breaking the law. He always told his daughter, "No matter how hard it gets, I will never do anything wrong." But now, he sat in a jail cell, awaiting a verdict that seemed almost predetermined. Lillian didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew her father was innocent. She just wanted him to come back, to hold that rough but warm hand once again. But was the world fair to a child? No one cared about what she felt. No one stood up to ask whether Daniel Walker was truly guilty. Elsewhere in the city, Emma Carter couldn't take her eyes off the articles about the case. She had read and reread all the reports, watched the brief interviews on television, but something about it made her restless. The evidence against Daniel was so flimsy, yet everything seemed to be going perfectly for Prosecutor Benjamin Hayes. Somehow, no one dared to ask questions. Supporters of Daniel were quickly silenced, while Judge Richard Donovan continuously rejected any defense efforts. Emma felt like there was a veil hiding the truth, a suspicious setup no one seemed to notice, or perhaps they had noticed but chose to stay silent. But Emma couldn't stay silent. One day, on a dreary winter afternoon, Emma visited a small hospital on the outskirts of town where her mother was working a long shift. As she walked down the cold, white corridor, she instinctively stopped in front of a patient room. Through the glass door, she saw a frail little girl with thin hair sitting curled up on the bed, her eyes filled with sadness. "Who is that girl?" Emma asked a nurse nearby. The nurse sighed. "That's Lillian Walker, Daniel Walker's daughter. She's here because her health is getting worse. But what's even worse is that her father might be sentenced to life in prison. She'll lose her only family." Emma's heart tightened. She had never thought about the real consequences of this case. A wrongful conviction wouldn't just destroy the life of an innocent man. It would take away a child's hope for survival. She stepped into the room and gently sat down beside Lillian. "What's your name?" Emma asked softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. The little girl looked up, her dark eyes tired but still holding on to a flicker of hope. "I'm Lillian." Emma smiled. "I'm Emma. Can I sit with you for a while?" Lillian nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. They sat there in a quiet space, but one full of meaning, a 16-year-old girl and a child fighting against fate. And in that moment, Emma knew that she couldn't stand still any longer. She looked into Lillian's eyes and made a promise to herself. I won't let this happen. No matter what, I will do something. The courtroom was packed, with not a single empty seat left. Dozens of reporters crowded the public seating area, cameras flashing nonstop, capturing every moment of the trial. The air felt heavy, as though an invisible pressure was weighing down on everyone present. The attendees whispered to one another, some eagerly awaiting a harsh verdict while others cast anxious glances toward the defendant. Amidst the scene, Daniel Walker sat at the defendant's stand. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and his hair had grayed even though he was still under 50. His prison uniform hung loosely on his frail body, which had withered after days of imprisonment. He didn't squirm, didn't shout, didn't protest. He simply sat there, hands resting on his thighs, fingers trembling ever so slightly. But in his tired eyes, there was still one thing that never dimmed: hope. On the opposite end, Prosecutor Benjamin Hayes stepped forward with confidence. He was the type of man who could make others feel the weight of pressure even without saying a word. His sharp suit, tightly knotted tie, and slick black hair were all meticulously arranged. He held a stack of papers in his hand as he approached the jury, flashing a professional, calculating smile. Your Honor, Hayes spoke, his voice slow and clear, each word cutting into the minds of those listening like a cold knife. Today we are here to try a serious crime, a crime that the perpetrator tried to hide. And that man, no one else but Daniel Walker. He paused for a moment, scanning the courtroom, allowing his words to settle before continuing. The defendant was near the crime scene with no valid alibi. He is a man struggling with overwhelming debt, desperate for his sick daughter's survival. And when cornered, he chose the path of crime. Emma clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. She glared at Hayes, her eyes burning with anger. He was weaving a perfect, dramatic story, but there was no clear evidence to back it up. Daniel shook his head, his lips parted as though he wanted to say something. But immediately his defense attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling him to remain silent. Emma furrowed her brow, studying the man. He didn't seem like he was fighting to defend his client. His forehead was dotted with sweat, his hands shaky as he flipped through the papers on his desk, but he didn't seem to be making any headway in forming a counterargument. Then it hit Emma. This defense attorney wasn't good. He didn't have the skills to face off against a sharp, dangerous prosecutor like Hayes. Perhaps he had already accepted the outcome of the trial and had given up. Her frustration flared up even more. She glanced at Judge Richard Donovan, who was sitting silently on his high bench, his face as cold and expressionless as stone. His gaze was sharp, showing no hint of doubt in Hayes's words. He sat there like a judge accustomed to delivering sentences without a care for the truth. Hayes continued, his voice sinking deeper into the minds of the listeners. Think about it, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. A man struggling financially, a man with no way out, and then he chooses the simplest option, taking the life of another. No one interrupted him. No one objected. The tension in the courtroom grew even heavier. Some jury members started nodding, perhaps swayed by his words. Emma could see it clearly. Her throat went dry. She wanted to scream that Hayes was lying. She wanted to shout that this wasn't a normal case. She wanted to say that something was being hidden, that justice was being distorted right before their eyes. But if she spoke, who would believe her? She was just a 16-year-old girl with no power, no evidence, no place in this trial. She looked at Daniel Walker, into his desperate eyes that still clung to hope. If he lost today, he would never get another chance to see his daughter again. Lillian would lose her only parent, and she would have to spend her life in a hospital with no one to hold her hand when the pain came. Emma took a deep breath. She didn't know what she would do, but she knew one thing. If she did nothing, Daniel Walker would be wrongfully convicted, and she couldn't let that happen. Emma sat still in the back row, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug deep into her palms. Each of Prosecutor Hayes's words felt like daggers cutting through the air. But what bothered her the most wasn't the accusations he was making. It was how everything seemed to be unfolding so smoothly. Every detail in the case appeared perfectly aligned in Hayes's favor, as if everything had been orchestrated from the start. She quietly took out her phone and reopened the old articles about the case. She had read them over and over before, but sitting here in the courtroom now, she had a strange feeling, like there was something incredibly important that she had missed. There was one detail in the case files that had caught her attention from the beginning. It was the testimony of a witness named Mark Reynolds, a security guard at the parking lot where the crime had occurred. According to the initial report, Mark had seen a completely different man leaving the scene the night of the murder, but strangely, his testimony was never included in the official case files. Worse still, Mark had disappeared from public view as soon as the case started drawing attention. Emma quickly scrolled through the articles, trying to find more information about Mark, but all she could find were vague mentions of him suddenly leaving the city just before the trial began. A key witness, one who could completely change the course of the case, disappears without a trace. That couldn't just be a coincidence. She looked up at Prosecutor Hayes, who was still confidently presenting before the jury. He knew. He absolutely knew that Mark could destroy his entire argument, and that was why he had done something to ensure that the man couldn't testify. The more she thought about it, the more a simmering anger rose inside her. But that wasn't all. She turned to look at the defense attorney sitting next to Daniel. He looked exhausted, his eyes glazed over as he absently flipped through the papers on his desk, as if he didn't believe in what he was doing either. He weakly objected to some of Hayes's points, but his voice was so feeble it was nearly drowned out by the atmosphere in the courtroom. Your Honor, the defendant has the right to be defended against baseless accusations. Judge Donovan raised an eyebrow, then sighed in frustration. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes betraying a clear lack of patience. Overruled, he said curtly, signaling for Hayes to continue. Emma stared at Donovan. He didn't even bother to consider the defense's objections. No re-examination, no further questions. He simply dismissed the defense's attempts like they were a pointless formality. She felt a cold fear run down her spine. This trial wasn't a fair hearing. It was more like a play with the ending already decided. Hayes was the one writing the script. Judge Donovan was the one ensuring that no one could change it. And Daniel Walker was just a helpless character heading towards the tragic conclusion. Emma swallowed hard, trying to organize her thoughts. She knew that if no one stood up, Daniel would never have a chance at freedom. But the question was, what could she do? What could a 16-year-old girl change in a trial that had already been manipulated from the start? She looked at Daniel. His eyes were still patient, but Emma could see the desperation slowly eating away at his will. He was too tired, too defeated to keep fighting. He had accepted that justice doesn't always side with the innocent. But Emma couldn't accept that. She took a deep breath, her hand gripping her phone in her pocket. If no one else would act, she would. If no one else dared to speak the truth, she would be the one to speak up. But what she didn't know was that in just a few minutes, she would do something that no one had ever dared to do in front of Judge Donovan, and it would change everything. The air in the courtroom became suffocatingly heavy. Judge Donovan leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the wooden gavel, his cold gaze sweeping across the jury before his low, gravelly voice filled the room. Before we reach a final verdict, I would like to remind everyone that justice must be executed based on evidence and sound reasoning. And with what has been presented throughout this trial, Emma couldn't listen any longer. Her breath quickened, her heart pounded as if it would burst from her chest. She glanced at Daniel Walker, seeing the resignation in his eyes, and then the image of Lillian appeared in her mind. If she did nothing today, if she allowed this trial to proceed as those in power had planned, Daniel Walker would be convicted, Lillian would lose her father, and the truth would be buried forever. She couldn't let that happen. Emma stood up from her seat. You're wrong. The words rang out, reverberating through the courtroom. The room froze. Pens fell from reporters' desks, and some people gasped in disbelief at what had just happened. A young girl, a 16-year-old child, had just dared to interrupt Judge Donovan in the middle of a trial. Whispers began to ripple through the room, spreading like a wave. The reporters whispered among themselves, cameras flashing furiously to capture this rare moment. No one had ever dared to stand up in Judge Donovan's courtroom. No one had ever challenged his authority in front of the jury. But now, a small girl had done what no one else had. Judge Donovan froze for a second. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and his hand gripped the gavel. The whole room held its breath, waiting for his reaction. What did you just say? His voice was low, cold, and dangerous. Emma took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew she was putting herself in danger, but she also knew that if she didn't speak up, no one else would. She looked straight into Donovan's eyes. You're wrong. This man is innocent. The breath of everyone in the room seemed to catch. Prosecutor Hayes, standing nearby, furrowed his brow, his sharp gaze sweeping over Emma. A flicker of anger passed across his face, but hidden beneath his eyes was a flicker of worry. He didn't know who this girl was, but he knew any disruption could derail his perfect plan. Donovan slammed the gavel down onto the desk. Do you realize what you just did? He growled, his voice even darker now. You dare interrupt me in my court? Do you understand the consequences of your disrespect? Emma clenched her hands, but didn't back down. I know, but I also know that something is wrong with this trial. You are about to sentence an innocent man. Whispers grew louder, this time more intense. Some reporters quickly jotted down notes, while others exchanged hushed words, trying to understand what was happening. Prosecutor Hayes gritted his teeth, trying to maintain control. Who is this girl? He sneered. A witness I've never heard of? A young legal expert, perhaps? A small chuckle rippled from some in the audience, but Emma refused to be swayed. She turned her cold gaze to Hayes. You know I'm not a witness, but you also know I'm telling the truth. Silence stretched on for a few seconds. Judge Donovan exhaled, placing a hand on his forehead, trying to control his anger. Do you have evidence to back that up? If not, I'll have the guards remove you from here immediately. Emma took a deep breath, lifting her chin high. I do. The room erupted. Reporters surged forward to snap photos. The jury members exchanged glances, curiosity mixed with unease. Prosecutor Hayes narrowed his eyes, his hand clenched tight. Judge Donovan stared at Emma, his gaze darkening, but instead of dismissing her immediately, he sat still, studying her with consideration. There was something in the way she spoke that made him hesitate. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the small girl standing in the middle of the room, a place where no one should have been unless they were a lawyer or an official witness. But Emma Carter stood there unwavering, not backing down, even in front of Judge Richard Donovan, a man known for his cold, ruthless decisions. Are you saying the evidence has been tampered with? Judge Donovan's voice was deep and imposing, an unbearable weight filling the room. His sharp gaze fixed on Emma, as if he intended to crush her with the full force of his authority. Are you aware that you are making a very serious accusation? Emma took a deep breath. She knew this was not just a trial. It was a psychological battle. If she showed even the slightest sign of weakness, if she hesitated for a moment, they would immediately dismiss her and throw her out of the courtroom without hearing another word. Yes, Your Honor, she said, keeping her voice calm and steady. I fully understand the gravity of what I've just said, and I will prove that crucial evidence in this case has been hidden. A murmur spread throughout the courtroom. Some members of the jury exchanged glances. A few reporters quickly raised their pens, scribbling notes. Prosecutor Hayes, who had maintained his composure until now, subtly tilted his head, his eyes flashing with a dangerous gleam. How interesting, he said slowly, walking towards Emma like a predator closing in on its prey. You say there's hidden evidence? A very bold claim for a 16-year-old girl. He emphasized her age with a mocking tone, as if that alone should be enough to dismiss her words. Emma stood firm. She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. My age doesn't matter. What matters is whether what I'm saying is the truth. Hayes smirked. Then tell me, what are you talking about? Emma took a deep breath, then spoke decisively. Prosecutor Hayes intentionally hid a crucial piece of evidence. A witness saw another man leaving the scene of the crime, but his testimony was never included in the case files. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Some reporters quickly moved forward, recording every word. Several members of the jury furrowed their brows, clearly affected by what Emma had just said. Prosecutor Hayes laughed dismissively, but his smile couldn't mask the tension that briefly flashed in his eyes. Quite the captivating story, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But there's one problem, Miss Carter. If there was a witness, then why isn't he here? Why is there no official documentation of his testimony? Emma didn't miss a beat. Because he disappeared just before the trial began. The room seemed to explode. Some people gasped, and a flood of discussions erupted around the room. The jury appeared confused, trying to process what Emma had just revealed. Emma didn't stop. She stared straight at Hayes. The name of that witness is Mark Reynolds, a security guard at the parking lot where the crime occurred. Initially, he gave a statement to the police, claiming he saw a completely different man leaving the scene that night. But his testimony was dismissed, and when the trial began, he vanished. No one knows where he went. No one can contact him. Judge Donovan furrowed his brow. He lightly tapped his fingers on the desk, his gaze briefly showing signs of contemplation. Emma didn't stop. She pressed on, her voice steady. I'm not saying you are responsible for Mark Reynolds' disappearance. She paused, then continued. But what I am saying is that it benefited you when he vanished. Those words landed like a slap across Hayes' face. His jaw clenched, and his hand unconsciously formed a fist. Judge Donovan turned to Prosecutor Hayes. Prosecutor Hayes, I want you to explain the disappearance of this witness. Hayes took a deep breath, regaining his composure. He spoke slowly. Your Honor, the witness this young lady is referring to never provided any evidence to back up his testimony. Furthermore, the police found no traces of anyone else at the scene. Therefore, his testimony was unreliable, and I made the decision to dismiss it. Emma immediately countered, her voice sharp. Unreliable? Or were you afraid that if he testified, this case would fall apart? Once again, the murmurs grew louder. Some reporters exchanged glances, intrigued by this sudden turn of events. This was no longer just a trial. It had turned into a confrontation. Hayes smirked, but this time his smile lacked the confidence it had before. Judge Donovan slammed his gavel down, signaling for order in the room. He stared at Hayes for a moment, then turned to Emma. The silence stretched on. Finally, he spoke slowly. Miss Carter, if you truly have evidence that this witness was unnaturally removed, I will request an immediate investigation. Emma's heart raced. She had done it. But just as she thought she had gained some ground, she realized something. She hadn't just angered Prosecutor Hayes. She had angered the people behind him, and they wouldn't let her continue so easily. She had entered a much larger battle than she had ever imagined. Prosecutor Hayes sneered, but the confidence he had once projected was now replaced with something darker. He adjusted his cuff, then turned to look at Emma with eyes sharp as a wolf watching its prey, someone who dared challenge his power. He stepped forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. How amusing, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. Here we are in the middle of a serious trial, judging a grave crime. And now what? A 16-year-old child suddenly appears, thinking she can lecture us about justice? Whispers began to spread throughout the courtroom. Some nodded in agreement with Hayes, while others exchanged looks of curiosity. Several reporters had already started scribbling notes, some pointing their cameras directly at Emma. This young girl had shattered the monotony of the trial and made everything far more dramatic than it had been. Emma felt the contempt in Hayes's every word, but she didn't let it faze her. She took a deep breath and kept her voice steady. So, if I'm just a child who knows nothing about the law, why does Prosecutor Hayes feel the need to rebut me? For a moment, Hayes was taken aback by Emma's quick retort. He hadn't expected her to counter so swiftly. A few quiet chuckles came from the back rows. The jury, which had been swaying toward Hayes's argument, now seemed to waver. Judge Donovan slammed his gavel down hard, the sharp sound cutting through the murmurs, forcing the room into a temporary silence. He shot a glare at Emma, his face filled with irritation. Miss Carter, you're interrupting the court. If you don't have anything truly important to say, I will have you removed from this room immediately. Emma knew her time was running out. This was her only chance to speak the truth, and she couldn't let it slip away. She took a deep breath, clenching her fists to steady herself. Your Honor, I do not intend to disrupt the trial, she said, her voice clear and firm. I only ask for an opportunity to prove that evidence in this case has been manipulated. If I'm wrong, you can have me removed. But if I'm right, an innocent man may be wrongfully convicted, and none of us can undo that mistake. Her words rang out across the courtroom, filling the space with a tense silence. Judge Donovan stared at her, his cold gaze seemingly weighing her words. A prolonged silence enveloped the room, the atmosphere so heavy it felt suffocating. Finally, he let out a deep sigh and spoke in a low, authoritative tone. You have 5 minutes. The courtroom erupted. Whispers grew louder than ever before. Some reporters rushed forward to take pictures, their cameras flashing nonstop. Members of the jury whispered to each other, clearly drawn to the unprecedented moment unfolding before them. Prosecutor Hayes clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing with fury. He hadn't thought that Judge Donovan would actually allow Emma to speak. He glared at her as if silently warning her that she had just made a terrible mistake. But Emma was not intimidated. She stood tall, her heart racing in her chest, but her voice was more solid than ever before. She had 5 minutes to change everything, and she would not waste a single second. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened as Judge Donovan announced that Emma had 5 minutes to present her case. Everyone in the room was watching, waiting to see if this 16-year-old girl could say something substantial enough to sway the trial. Prosecutor Hayes crossed his arms, offering a thin, mocking smile, but his eyes flickered with caution. He knew this girl wasn't as simple as she appeared. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She glanced toward the jury, where a few members had already begun showing signs of doubt. This was the most critical moment. "Your Honor," Emma said, her gaze fixed on Judge Donovan. "It would be useless for me to say anything without specific evidence. And I believe that right now, there is someone who can provide exactly what this court needs to see the truth." At that moment, the courtroom doors suddenly swung open. All eyes immediately turned toward the entrance. The tension in the air froze. In that instant, a woman stepped in. Her dark brown hair was tied back neatly, her eyes sharp, yet her face clearly showed tension. She wore a dark-colored blazer, looking professional, though it was clear she hesitated with every step she took. Emma turned around, locking eyes with the woman, her expression resolute. "Your Honor, this is Olivia Jensen. She used to work in the prosecutor's office and has important information regarding this case." The room erupted in whispers. Some reporters immediately leaned forward, trying to snap a photo of the woman who had just entered. Prosecutor Hayes tightened his fist, his face changing immediately. A flash of anxiety crossed his expression, though he tried to hide it. Judge Donovan raised an eyebrow. "Miss Jensen, can you explain why you're here?" Olivia briefly glanced at Emma, as if seeking some reassurance, before taking a deep breath and facing the judge. "Your Honor, I worked in the prosecutor's office. I have documents proving that evidence in this case has been tampered with." Silence enveloped the room. The jury was practically frozen. Some members gaped. Even the reporters, who were used to unexpected situations, couldn't hide their shock. A former prosecutor's office employee had just stepped into the courtroom and declared that the prosecutor had tampered with evidence. Hayes gritted his teeth but quickly regained his composure. He smirked, though the smile was now laced with more malice than before. "How interesting," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "An anonymous witness shows up at the last minute, suddenly claiming I tampered with evidence? Should I applaud this perfectly executed act?" But Emma didn't let him steer the situation. She looked directly at Olivia, her voice stronger than ever. "Miss Jensen, can you clarify what documents you have?" Olivia swallowed hard, then slowly opened her purse, pulling out a thick brown envelope sealed securely. She held it up high so everyone in the room could see. "Inside this," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm, "are internal emails from the prosecutor's office. They contain messages showing that Prosecutor Hayes ordered the removal of witness Mark Reynolds' testimony, the man who saw a different suspect leaving the scene the night of the crime." The courtroom nearly exploded. Some people jumped to their feet, and the murmurs turned into uncontrolled discussions. Reporters quickly scribbled notes, and phones were whipped out to capture this crucial moment. This was no longer just a trial. It had become a scandal. Judge Donovan slammed his gavel down hard, signaling for order. He looked at Olivia with a piercing gaze. "Miss Jensen, are you prepared to submit these documents to the court for investigation?" Olivia nodded immediately. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Donovan turned to one of the courtroom officers. "Please take that document into custody immediately." The officer quickly walked up, took the envelope from Olivia, and placed it on the judge's desk. Donovan flipped through a few pages, his expression growing more serious with each turn. No one could see exactly what was inside, but the judge's face said it all. Prosecutor Hayes clenched his jaw and slowly spoke. "Your Honor, I believe we shouldn't rush to conclusions. This could just be a misunderstanding or even a forged document." Emma couldn't let him dismiss it so easily. She stepped forward, her eyes burning with determination. "If you're innocent, why are you so worried?" Hayes turned to look at her, and for the first time, There was no longer contempt in his eyes, only genuine weariness. Judge Donovan took a deep breath, then slowly closed the file. He paused for a few seconds, as if weighing every word he was about to say. Given what has just been presented, he said, his voice slower than before, I am ordering a suspension of this trial immediately. We will open an investigation into the authenticity of these documents before continuing with the proceedings. The courtroom erupted again, this time louder than ever. No one had expected this. What had seemed like a trial with a clear outcome was now put on hold due to an unexpected document. Emma felt a wave of exhilaration sweep through her body. She had done it. She had opened a door, a chance to bring justice back. But she also knew that she had just declared war on a force she couldn't fully comprehend. She looked at Hayes, and this time she saw the unmistakable fury in his eyes. He knew the game had changed, and he wouldn't let this go easily. The courtroom was thick with tension as Judge Donovan flipped through the stack of documents on his desk. His eyes scanned the pages without revealing any reaction. The room was still, all eyes waiting for his decision. Emma held her breath, feeling the rapid beat of her heart in her chest. This was the critical moment, the line between justice and lies. Then Donovan slowly looked up, his gaze not directed at Emma or Olivia, but at Prosecutor Hayes. These documents, they could clarify some unclear points in this case. Donovan's voice was low, but there was a clear hesitation in it. He paused for a few seconds, scanning the room, before continuing. However, there's no guarantee that this information is sufficient to overturn the entire process. Prosecutor Hayes is a reputable figure, has worked in this field for many years, and I see no reason to doubt his professionalism. The room erupted in murmurs. Some reporters quickly scribbled notes, while others shook their heads in disappointment. Emma felt as if someone had poured ice water over her. It wasn't because the decision was unexpected. She had predicted Donovan would protect the system he had served for so many years. It was because of the blatant injustice unfolding right before her eyes. Olivia clenched her fists, her eyes flashing with desperation. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected the judge to so easily ignore such critical evidence. I've been threatened. Olivia suddenly spoke, her voice shaking but filled with resolve. I wanted to reveal these documents earlier, but they warned me. I received anonymous letters, late-night phone calls. I was forced to stay silent. The room buzzed with even louder whispers. Some members of the jury exchanged glances, clearly beginning to waver. Prosecutor Hayes remained still, but his hand tightened around the edge of the table, his face darkening. He knew that if this continued, he could lose control of the situation. Emma couldn't bear it any longer. She felt a surge of anger burning in her chest, burning away any remaining fear. She stepped forward, her fists clenched. Are you really going to imprison an innocent man? Her voice cracked with emotion, but it didn't tremble. The room went silent. All eyes turned to her, some in shock, some in discomfort, but most in a state of uncertainty. Emma stared into Judge Donovan's eyes, her own filled with fury and determination. You're telling me that despite the evidence, despite a witness willing to stand up and speak the truth, you'll continue this trial as if nothing is happening? Do you truly believe justice lies in the hands of those with power? Donovan stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. He placed his hand on the desk, his fingers tapping lightly in rhythm. For a brief moment, hesitation flickered in his eyes, but then he took a deep breath and spoke in a calm, almost indifferent tone. I can only judge based on what has been legally presented before the court. If there is no clear and valid evidence, I cannot delay the trial just because of mere accusations. Emma's anger surged again, but before she could speak, Hayes stepped forward, cutting her thoughts off. Enough, he said, his voice controlled but firm. We've allowed this chaos to go on long enough. I suggest we proceed with the trial in the proper legal manner. Emma scanned the room, searching for any sign of support, but at this moment, it felt like everyone was waiting for a miracle. She could see the jury wavering, but no one dared to stand up. She could see Olivia trembling, but still standing firm. And she could see Daniel Walker, the man who never should have been in this position, bowing his head as if he had accepted his fate. She couldn't let that happen. The courtroom seemed to freeze as Emma's words hung in the air, but Prosecutor Hayes maintained his calm demeanor, as though everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. He turned to Emma, then back to Judge Donovan, his eyes cold and calculating like a predator observing its prey. "Your Honor," Hayes said, his voice controlled, "we cannot allow baseless accusations to disrupt the trial. This girl is neither a lawyer nor an official witness. She's just an impulsive teenager driven by emotions. What she's saying has no legal value." Some in the courtroom nodded in agreement, but the murmurs from the crowd continued. There was something off, and everyone could feel it. Emma gritted her teeth, but before she could respond, Olivia Jensen stepped forward, still holding the stack of documents tightly in her hands. "I have evidence," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes unwavering. "I'm not just speaking in words. I have documents proving that Prosecutor Hayes intentionally suppressed evidence that could help the defendant." This time, the courtroom froze. Prosecutor Hayes raised an eyebrow, but his eyes flashed with a flicker of caution. "Miss Jensen," he said slowly, as though carefully selecting each word, "do you really want to destroy your reputation over a few documents that might be misunderstood?" Olivia clenched her fists. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, then walked straight to the evidence table, pulling out a thick, sealed manila folder. "These documents," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "contain internal emails between Prosecutor Hayes and several officials in the prosecutor's office, including orders to remove the testimony of witness Mark Reynolds, who saw a different suspect at the scene. These emails are proof that he actively manipulated the case to ensure Daniel Walker was convicted." Gasps filled the room. Hayes tried to maintain his composure, but Emma could see his hands clenching into fists. He knew he was losing control. Before he could respond, a reporter in the front row suddenly stood up. It was James Carter, a veteran investigative journalist from the Tribune, known for his in-depth pieces on the justice system. He turned around, looking directly at Prosecutor Hayes, and raised his voice. "What is happening in this justice system?" The room exploded. Other reporters raised their recording devices, some snapping photos rapidly. A flurry of discussions erupted as people in the gallery exchanged excited whispers. This was no longer just an ordinary trial. It was a scandal that could shake the entire legal system. Judge Donovan could no longer maintain his calm. He slammed his gavel down, but it took several seconds for the noise to subside. He turned to Olivia, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Jensen, are you certain about the authenticity of these documents?" Olivia nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. If you need, I can provide the server data and backups from the internal system to verify this." Her words were like a devastating blow to the entire case. Some members of the jury looked visibly shocked. Prosecutor Hayes inhaled deeply, but this time the arrogance was gone. He knew he was cornered. He tilted his head slightly, glancing at Judge Donovan as though seeking his reaction. Donovan hesitated. Emma could see it clearly, but she also knew that if he continued to protect Hayes, he would be dragged into this scandal. Whatever Donovan said next would determine the fate of this trial. The courtroom was deathly silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on Judge Donovan, waiting for him to make his final decision. All the evidence was laid on the table. Documents proving that Prosecutor Hayes had deliberately hidden the truth, internal emails showing a key witness had been silenced, and direct testimonies from Olivia Jensen, a former prosecutor's office employee. There was no doubt anymore. This case had been manipulated. Emma gripped her hands tightly, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. She could feel Daniel Walker's breath, the man who had been wrongfully imprisoned all this time. He sat there, his hands placed on the table, his gaze flickering with faint hope. If justice truly existed, then right now, he should be set free. Judge Donovan took a deep breath, then slowly placed the gavel down on the desk. No one dared to move. The jury exchanged confused glances, while the reporters held their breath, their fingers poised on their recorders, waiting for the next word. Then he spoke. "Given the evidence that has been presented, I believe a more comprehensive investigation is necessary to verify the authenticity of these documents." He paused, then looked toward Daniel Walker. "Therefore, I declare a suspension of the trial until we have the results of the official investigation." The room erupted. Loud shouts came from the gallery. The reporters turned to each other in shock, some quickly typing on their keyboards, others unable to believe what they had just heard. Suspend the trial? How could that be? All the evidence was clear. Why wouldn't he declare an acquittal right away? Emma felt her entire body tense with anger. She tightened her fists, unable to believe what she had just heard. "No, this can't be," she shouted, nearly jumping to her feet again. "Why are you postponing? Everything is already clear. You cannot keep him locked up for another day." But Donovan did not look at her. He simply tapped the gavel lightly on the desk again, his tone indifferent. "Miss Carter, this is the court's decision. If you continue causing a disturbance, I will have the guards remove you from the courtroom." Emma felt a surge of raw fury rise within her. She had fought to bring the truth to light, but just when justice seemed about to be served, it was being blatantly twisted. And worse still, the one who should be punished was walking away victorious. Prosecutor Hayes stepped back from the prosecutor's table, adjusting his tie, then turned and walked out of the courtroom. His expression was calm, but there was a clear arrogance behind it. He knew he had escaped. He knew that even though he had been exposed in the middle of the trial, the system was still protecting him. He glanced briefly at Emma, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small smirk, as if to say, "You think you can win? This system is bigger than you, kid." Emma gritted her teeth, her chest tightening with frustration. Daniel Walker lowered his head, his eyes hollow. Once again, justice had betrayed him. Emma couldn't bear it anymore. She stood up, shouting one last time, her voice reverberating throughout the courtroom. "Are you going to let an innocent man sit in prison while the real criminal walks free? Is this the justice you protect?" But no one answered. None of those with power stood up to defend what was right. All that remained was a rotten system covering up for itself. The courtroom was still echoing with murmurs and disbelief after Judge Donovan's shocking decision. Emma stood motionless, her fist clenched tightly, her entire body trembling with rage. Justice had been flagrantly distorted right in front of her. Daniel Walker remained in custody while the one who had manipulated the case walked away with arrogance. Prosecutor Hayes still wore a smug smile on his face. He adjusted his tie, glancing at Emma once more, before turning to leave the courtroom. He thought he had won. But then, at that moment, the large courtroom door swung open once more. A group of people in black suits stepped inside, their faces cold and their eyes sharp. They were not reporters, not lawyers, and certainly not regular police officers. Leading the group was a tall man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, the FBI badge proudly displayed on his chest. The room fell silent. The man stepped forward, his eyes quickly scanning the entire room before locking onto Judge Donovan. He held up a badge in front of the judge, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable authority. "Nathan Reynolds, FBI agent." He paused for a moment before continuing. "We are conducting a federal investigation into corruption within the judicial system, and Prosecutor Benjamin Hayes is the primary subject of this investigation." Silence engulfed the room. Everyone was stunned. Reporters were almost in disbelief, some quickly raising their cameras, the sound of rapid clicks filling the air. The jury, the lawyers, even Judge Donovan seemed to falter. Prosecutor Hayes, who less than a minute ago had been smugly basking in his supposed victory, froze in the hallway, his body stiff as if it had been frozen in place. "What is this?" He tried to maintain composure, but anyone could hear the tension in his voice. Agent Reynolds did not respond immediately. He simply gestured for one of the FBI agents behind him, who quickly stepped forward and placed a thick stack of documents on Judge Donovan's desk. "We have clear evidence of a corruption network within the prosecutor's office," Reynolds continued, his voice unwavering. "We have been monitoring Prosecutor Hayes for several months, and from our internal investigation, we discovered that he has intentionally manipulated numerous cases, using his position to distort justice to serve the interests of those behind him." The room erupted. Shouts and conversations filled the air. Some reporters even jumped to their feet, firing off questions in rapid succession. Emma gaped, her heart racing so fast she could feel it pounding in her chest. She had suspected Hayes. She had tried to expose the truth, but she never imagined that this entire case was just a small part of a much larger corruption network. Hayes stepped back, but two agents immediately moved forward to block his path. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the cold metal gleaming under the courtroom lights. "Wait!" Hayes yelled, the panic finally evident on his face. "You can't do this. I'm a federal prosecutor. I have immunity." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Prosecutor Hayes, You are under arrest for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and corruption within the legal system. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you in court. Prosecutor Hayes, who had once stood in a position of absolute power in this very courtroom, was now the one being handcuffed in the place he had once controlled. Emma couldn't believe her eyes. The discussions around her continued to explode. Some people were clapping. Some jury members exchanged looks, clearly shocked. Judge Donovan remained still in his chair, his face pale, as he realized that everything had just spiraled beyond his control. Hayes was escorted out of the courtroom, his face still showing disbelief. He never thought he would be betrayed by the very system he had been manipulating. Emma took a deep breath, and for the first time since the trial began, she felt a sense of relief. Justice had finally fought back. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the courtroom windows as Judge Donovan declared the trial over, his voice lowered, carrying a clear hesitation. Despite his reluctance, he could not ignore the undeniable evidence of Daniel Walker's wrongful conviction. A heavy silence fell over the room as he slowly delivered the final verdict. Based on the newly provided documents and testimony, I hereby dismiss all charges against the defendant, Daniel Walker. He is to be released immediately. A brief moment of stillness passed, and then the courtroom erupted. Applause filled the air, and reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing relentlessly. Some members of the jury exhaled in relief, while Daniel Walker's eyes welled with tears. He looked around, almost unable to believe that this was real. After months of imprisonment, countless nights plagued by fear, he had finally stepped out of the darkness. Daniel stood, his legs trembling but resolute, as he approached the door. A small voice called out, "Dad!" Daniel froze. In front of him was Lillian, his little daughter, running toward him, tears streaming down her face. She paid no mind to the crowd or the eyes watching around her. She saw only the figure of her father. Daniel knelt down, his arms outstretched, enveloping his daughter in a tight embrace, as though afraid that if he let go, it would all be a dream. Lillian clutched his shirt, sobbing silently. The sight brought an eerie quiet to the courtroom. Emma, standing nearby, witnessed the moment, unable to hold back her own tears. Every effort, every struggle she had fought, it was all for this moment. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had gathered early. As Daniel and Lillian stepped out the door, cheers erupted, and reporters immediately pointed their cameras at them. On social media, Emma Carter's name was being mentioned at a rapid pace. Posts spread like wildfire with emotional headlines. Teen hero swings trial. 16-year-old girl did what the justice system wouldn't. Emma Carter, symbol of justice. Videos of her standing firm in the courtroom, confronting the prosecutor to uncover the truth, quickly went viral. But amidst the celebration, Emma still felt something was missing. The next day, during a special interview on national television, a reporter asked Emma, "You've succeeded in exposing a wrongful conviction, helping a man regain his freedom, but do you think justice has truly been served?" Emma stared into the camera, pausing for a moment before answering. No. Her response silenced the entire studio. She took a deep breath and continued. Justice isn't just about freeing an innocent person. True justice ensures that people like Daniel Walker are never wrongfully convicted in the first place. The reporter nodded and asked, "And what about Judge Donovan? Will he be removed from his position?" Emma frowned slightly. This was the part that disappointed her most. Despite delivering a flawed verdict and allowing the truth to be hidden for so long, Judge Donovan had not been immediately removed from office. He was only temporarily suspended for investigation, but everyone knew that without public pressure, he could easily return to the bench one day. Justice had been served, but not perfectly. There were still hundreds, even thousands, of people like Daniel Walker behind bars for wrongful convictions. There were still prosecutors like Hayes willing to manipulate evidence to win. And there were still judges like Donovan who placed their power above justice. After the interview ended, Emma sat quietly, gazing out the window. The sky was beautiful today, but the world was still far from fair. Lillian had her father back, but how many other children out there were still waiting for a miracle? Emma knew her fight was not over, and she was ready to fight until the end. If you are inspired by stories with unexpected twists, moral challenges, and the impact of kindness, please support us by liking or subscribing to Emotional Journey. We put our heart and soul into each story, and it really means a lot to have you come along for the ride. Thank you for being a part of this journey.